There comes a moment in life that almost no one prepares you for. You begin to change, and instead of feeling proud, you feel unsettled. Not because something went wrong, not because you made a mistake, but because something inside you is shifting, and you cannot explain why it feels so heavy. Growth is supposed to feel like progress, like freedom, like relief. But often, it does not. Instead, it feels like an internal conflict you never agreed to have. One part of you feels relief. You are becoming more honest, more aware, more aligned with who you truly are. And yet another part feels tension, a quiet, persistent discomfort that follows you into silent moments. You feel lighter and heavier at the same time. There is excitement in the air, but there is also grief. Because growth is not simply adding something new, it is also losing something familiar. And the human nervous system does not celebrate loss, even when that loss is necessary. At first, the shift is subtle. You begin noticing things you once ignored. Conversations that used to feel normal now feel draining. Situations you once tolerated now feel misaligned. Expectations that once guided you now feel like pressure. Nothing dramatic has happened, and yet everything feels different. This creates a quiet internal friction. You are becoming who you are, but the world around you still expects who you were. And in that gap, guilt begins to grow. Not loud guilt, not obvious guilt. A subtle feeling that whispers, "Why does this feel uncomfortable if it's supposed to be good?" We are taught to associate growth with achievement, a promotion, a milestone, recognition, a visible step forward. But psychological growth rarely looks like a victory. It looks like confusion, like distance, like uncertainty. Like sitting in silence, realizing your inner world no longer fits your outer life. Growth does not always bring applause. Sometimes it brings stillness. Sometimes it brings loneliness. Sometimes it brings the realization that the person you have been no longer exists in the same way. And that realization carries weight. Because identity is not something we simply upgrade. It is something we slowly outgrow. There is no single turning point, no dramatic transformation scene. Instead, it happens in quiet moments. You notice you are listening more and speaking less. You stop laughing at things you used to find funny. You begin questioning patterns you once accepted without thought. And one day, you sense it clearly. You feel different. Not better, not superior, just different. And that difference creates distance between you and others, between you and your past self, between you and the roles you once performed automatically. This is often the first moment guilt appears, because belonging has always been tied to sameness, and now sameness is slipping away. Growth is not a celebration. It is a psychological shift. It is the quiet reorganization of your inner world. Values change. Boundaries emerge. Awareness deepens. Tolerance for what hurts you decreases. And although this movement brings you closer to authenticity, it also disrupts familiarity. Your nervous system senses change. Your identity senses loss. Your relationships sense distance. So instead of pure joy, you feel something more complex. Relief mixed with sadness. clarity mixed with uncertainty, freedom mixed with guilt. Not because growth is wrong, but because transformation always carries an emotional cost. And in the space between who you were and who you are becoming, guilt often appears first. One of the most disorienting truths about personal growth is this: you are not only becoming someone new, you are also losing someone familiar. And that loss is not always acknowledged. We tend to speak about growth as expansion, as gaining strength, clarity, confidence, direction. But growth is also subtraction. It removes identities that once protected you. It dissolves roles that once helped you belong. It weakens patterns that once made life predictable. And without those structures, a quiet question emerges. If I am no longer who I was, who am I now? For years, you learned how to function within certain roles. The peacemaker, the people pleaser, the strong one, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who never says no. These roles were not accidents. They helped you navigate relationships. They kept conflict low. They preserved connection. They created safety. But growth begins to expose the cost of these roles. You start noticing exhaustion, resentment, emotional depletion, a quiet sense of living for expectations instead of truth. Slowly, the roles begin to feel too tight, like clothes that once fit perfectly but now restrict movement. At first, you try to keep wearing them, out of habit, out of loyalty, out of fear. But eventually, something inside you resists. Not loudly, but persistently. And this resistance marks the beginning of identity change. Change is often framed as improvement, but the psyche does not interpret it that simply. Because the person you used to be was not random. That version of you survived difficult moments, adapted to environments, learned how to receive love, learned how to avoid rejection, learned how to stay safe. So when growth begins to dissolve that version of you, a deep fear can arise. If I let this version of me go, will I still be accepted? Will I still belong? Will I still be loved? Even if your new self is healthier, the old self feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. This is why growth can feel like stepping into open space without knowing if the ground will hold. There is a form of grief that rarely gets named. It does not follow death. It does not follow endings others can see. It does not come with rituals or condolences. It arrives when you realize you are no longer the person you once were. You may miss your old tolerance, your old innocence, your old certainty, your old belonging, your old ability to stay without questioning. You may miss how simple things felt before awareness deepened. This does not mean you want to go back. It means you are human. Because growth requires letting go, and letting go always contains grief. Inner mourning is subtle. It does not announce itself. Instead, it shows up as nostalgia for past versions of life, a strange tenderness toward your younger self, moments of unexpected sadness without clear cause, a feeling of standing between two identities. You are not who you were. You are not fully who you are becoming. You are in between. and in between can feel like loss. Not because the past was perfect, but because it was known. People do not only grieve others, they grieve past homes, past relationships, past chapters, past dreams, past identities, and they grieve past versions of themselves. The self who tolerated more, the self who questioned less, the self who stayed smaller to stay accepted, the self who did not yet see what they now see. Growth asks you to release that self with compassion, not rejection. Not because that version was wrong, but because it brought you this far. When identity shifts, guilt can emerge in unexpected ways. You may feel disloyal to who you used to be. You may feel like you are abandoning the person who survived your past. You may feel ungrateful for the coping strategies that once protected you. But growth is not betrayal. It is evolution. Still, evolution carries emotional weight. Because saying goodbye to a former self is not a single moment. It is a gradual unfolding, a quiet farewell. And in that farewell, grief and guilt often walk side by side, not as enemies of growth, but as witnesses to transformation. Personal growth does not happen in isolation. It unfolds within relationships, families, friendships, social circles, systems that have quietly adjusted to who you used to be. People learned how to interact with you based on your old boundaries, your old tolerance, your old patterns, your old role in the group. Without anyone realizing it, a balance formed, a predictable rhythm, an emotional ecosystem, an unspoken agreement about who you were and how you functioned within it. And growth begins to disturb that agreement. When you change internally, others do not immediately change with you. They still expect the same responses, the same availability, the same patience, the same compliance, the same emotional labor. Not because they are malicious, but because familiarity creates comfort. Your previous self helped stabilize the environment. You smoothed tensions. You avoided conflict. You showed up without limits. You absorbed emotional weight without complaint. And when you begin to shift those patterns, it can feel destabilizing, not only to you, but to everyone around you. Every relationship develops a structure, even when it is invisible. One person listens more, another speaks more. One carries responsibility, another relies on that stability. One adapts, another directs. These dynamics are rarely discussed. They simply become normal. But when growth begins, these roles shift. You start saying no. You stop over-explaining. You decline what drains you. You express disagreement. You choose honesty over harmony. And suddenly, the relationship must reorganize. This reorganization can feel uncomfortable because balance is being renegotiated, whether consciously or not. One of the most painful moments in personal growth comes when someone says, "You've changed." The words may be neutral, but the tone often carries disappointment or accusation. Sometimes it sounds like, "You used to be easier to talk to. You're not the same anymore. You've become distant. You think you're better now. What happened to the old you?" These statements rarely reflect your intentions. They reflect disruption. Because your growth has altered a familiar system. and systems resist disruption. Most pressure does not come as direct commands. It arrives subtly, through guilt-laced jokes, through disappointment in tone, through withdrawal of warmth, through comparisons to your past self, through reminders of who you used to be. This pressure carries a hidden message. Return to the version of yourself that kept things comfortable. Not necessarily because others wish to harm you, but because your change requires them to adjust. And adjustment requires effort. And not everyone is ready for that effort. Humans are wired for belonging, for connection, for acceptance, for relational harmony. When growth creates friction in relationships, the nervous system registers a potential threat. Am I losing connection? Am I causing discomfort? Am I making life harder for others? Even when you are acting from self-respect, the disruption can trigger guilt. Not because you did something wrong, but because you disrupted equilibrium. And disrupting equilibrium can feel like harming the system, even when the system required change. In family systems and social dynamics, stability is often prioritized over authenticity. When one person evolves, the system reacts. Some adjust, some resist, some criticize, some withdraw, some attempt to restore the old balance. Guilt often emerges as an internal response to this tension, a signal that something familiar is shifting, a reflex designed to preserve connection. But growth inevitably redefines connection. It replaces unconscious roles with conscious boundaries. It replaces compliance with clarity. It replaces silent endurance with self-respect. And although this transformation may create temporary discomfort, it also opens the possibility for healthier relationships, ones based on truth rather than roles. Growth does not require abandoning relationships, but it does require renegotiating your position within them. And renegotiation always involves discomfort, because systems resist change before they adapt. So if guilt arises as you grow, it does not mean you are doing something wrong. It may simply mean the system is adjusting. An adjustment is rarely silent, but it is often necessary for relationships to evolve alongside you. Growth does not only move you forward. Sometimes it makes you feel like you are leaving something or someone behind. Even when no one says it out loud, even when you never intended to create distance, even when your love for those people has not changed. You begin to sense an uncomfortable thought. If I keep moving forward, am I abandoning the people who stayed where I once was? This feeling can be quiet but powerful, because growth can create separation, not through rejection, but through divergence. Paths begin to differ, priorities begin to shift, worldviews begin to expand, choices begin to reflect a new direction. And suddenly, forward movement can feel like disloyalty. When you begin changing your habits, mindset, boundaries, or ambitions, you may notice that some relationships no longer move at the same pace. Conversations feel different. Shared interests fade. Values begin to diverge. Silences grow where connection once felt effortless. This does not mean anyone did something wrong. It means trajectories have shifted. But the emotional experience can feel like abandonment on both sides. You may feel you are walking away. Others may feel they are being left behind. Even when no one has moved physically, psychological distance can feel very real. And with that distance comes guilt. There is a psychological phenomenon often associated with trauma survivors, but it appears in quieter forms throughout everyday life: survivor's guilt. It emerges when one person escapes a difficult environment, evolves beyond limiting patterns, or gains opportunities that others around them did not. You may find yourself thinking, "Why do I get to move forward when others are still struggling? Why do I have opportunities they never had? Why am I growing when they remain stuck?" This guilt is not logical. It is relational. It is rooted in empathy and shared history. If you struggled together, suffered together, or endured similar circumstances, moving beyond those conditions can feel like breaking an unspoken pact, as if growth violates solidarity. Another hidden layer of guilt emerges from the fear of being perceived as superior. You may begin minimizing your progress, downplaying your growth, avoiding sharing positive changes, holding back opinions to avoid seeming different. Not because you believe you are better, but because you do not want to appear as if you think you are. Growth changes posture. It changes boundaries. It changes self-respect. And from the outside, self-respect can be misinterpreted as distance. Clarity can be misinterpreted as coldness. Confidence can be misinterpreted as arrogance. So you may instinctively shrink your growth to preserve relational comfort. If you grew up in an environment where struggle was shared, loyalty often meant sameness. Sameness meant belonging. Sameness meant safety. Sameness meant we are in this together. So when your path begins to diverge, emotionally, psychologically, or materially, it can feel like breaking that bond. Even positive change can trigger inner conflict. Earning more, living differently, setting boundaries, prioritizing mental health, choosing new environments, letting go of destructive patterns. You may feel as though you are crossing an invisible line, a line between who you were together and who you are becoming alone. And crossing that line can feel like betrayal. Not because you betrayed anyone, but because you are no longer participating in shared limitations. Humans carry a deep psychological loyalty to their origins, family systems, childhood environments, cultural expectations, social circles. This loyalty operates below conscious awareness. It whispers, stay relatable, stay familiar, stay who they recognize. Do not outgrow where you came from. Because belonging once depended on fitting within that system. And at one time, it truly did. But growth requires differentiation, the process of becoming a distinct individual while still maintaining connection. Differentiation can feel dangerous because it challenges the belief that love requires sameness. It does not. But your nervous system learned early that belonging required alignment. So moving beyond that alignment can trigger guilt, hesitation, and internal conflict. You can honor where you came from without remaining limited by it. You can love people without living their limitations. You can respect shared history without repeating inherited patterns. You can remain connected without remaining unchanged. Growth does not erase loyalty, but it transforms it. Instead of loyalty through sameness, it becomes loyalty through authenticity. Still, this transformation can feel emotionally complex because it requires releasing an outdated belief that evolving beyond your past means betraying it. If you feel guilt as you grow, it may not mean you are abandoning others. It may mean you are stepping beyond the boundaries that once defined your world. beyond shared limitations, beyond inherited expectations, beyond roles that once kept you connected through sameness. This does not sever love, it simply changes the shape of connection. But as that shape changes, guilt often appears, not as proof of betrayal, but as evidence that you are crossing into unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory is where growth lives. One of the quiet consequences of personal growth is this. You begin to see clearly what you once overlooked. Not because the world suddenly changed, but because your awareness did. Patterns you ignored become visible. Dynamics you tolerated become uncomfortable. Conversations you accepted begin to feel manipulative or draining. And the most unsettling realization is often this: nothing new is happening. You are simply noticing what was always there. At first, the recognition is subtle. You notice guilt being used to control decisions. You notice passive-aggressive comments disguised as humor. You notice emotional withdrawal used as punishment. You notice how your boundaries are tested, then dismissed. These patterns may have existed for years, but earlier you normalized them. You explained them away, minimized their impact, told yourself it was easier to keep peace than to confront discomfort. Now, awareness interrupts that autopilot, and what once felt normal begins to feel harmful. This shift can be deeply disorienting because it forces you to reevaluate relationships, environments, and patterns you once accepted without question. Growth reduces tolerance for self-betrayal. You begin noticing exhaustion where you once felt obligation, resentment where you once felt responsibility, emotional depletion where you once felt duty. You realize that what you called patience was often silence. What you called understanding was often self-erasure. What you called loyalty was often overextension. And slowly, something inside you stops cooperating, not out of rebellion, out of self-preservation. When you begin setting boundaries, guilt often arrives immediately. You say no and feel uneasy. You protect your time and feel selfish. You decline emotional labor and feel disloyal. You step back and feel as if you are abandoning someone. This reaction is not accidental. If your identity was built around being accommodating, supportive, and endlessly available, boundaries can feel like violations of who you were trained to be. Your nervous system interprets boundaries as risk of conflict, risk of rejection, risk of losing connection. So even healthy boundaries can trigger guilt, not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt old survival patterns. When people are accustomed to your unlimited access, boundaries can feel like denial. When people are accustomed to your compliance, boundaries can feel like resistance. When people are accustomed to your silence, boundaries can feel like confrontation. From their perspective, something has changed. From your perspective, something has finally become honest. But honesty can feel abrupt to those who benefited from your silence. So boundaries may be labeled as selfish, cold, dramatic, unnecessary, hostile. Not because they are any of these things, but because they alter the relational dynamic. There is an important distinction between aggression and self-protection. Aggression seeks to control others. Boundaries seek to define the self. Aggression invades. Boundaries clarify. Aggression escalates conflict. Boundaries prevent resentment. If you were never taught to witness healthy boundaries, they may feel harsh, even when they are expressed calmly. But discomfort does not equal harm. Often discomfort signals adjustment, and adjustment is necessary when relationships move from unconscious patterns to conscious interaction. When you stop tolerating harmful dynamics, some people may say you have become harder, less flexible, less forgiving, less easygoing. But what is often happening is not hardening, it is strengthening. You are no longer dissolving your needs to preserve harmony. You are no longer ignoring emotional costs. You are no longer sacrificing well-being for approval. This is not cruelty. It is self-respect. And self-respect can feel unfamiliar, both to you and to others, if your previous role required self-abandonment. Clarity removes illusions. Once you see unhealthy dynamics clearly, you cannot return to unawareness. And that clarity forces choices: to speak or remain silent, to stay or step back, to tolerate or protect, to maintain patterns or redefine them. These choices carry emotional weight, because they may alter relationships, expectations, and long-standing dynamics. So, guilt may arise, not because you are doing harm, but because you are no longer absorbing harm quietly. Growth does not turn you against others, it turns you toward truth. Truth about what drains you, truth about what harms you, truth about what you need in order to remain emotionally healthy. And while this truth may disrupt familiar patterns, it also creates the possibility of relationships built on mutual respect rather than silent endurance. If you feel guilt while establishing boundaries, it does not mean you have become unkind. It may mean you have stopped abandoning yourself. You did not become harder, you became healthier. And health often requires changes that comfort alone never allowed. One of the quiet fears that surfaces during personal growth is not failure, it is separation. As you change internally, the social landscape around you can begin to shift. Connections evolve, conversations feel different, shared interests dissolve, emotional alignment weakens. And without any dramatic ending, distance can begin to appear. Growth does not always push people away, but it can reveal when paths are no longer moving in the same direction. And that divergence can feel like loss. When priorities shift, relationships often reorganize. You may become less available for familiar routines, less interested in conversations rooted in negativity, less willing to participate in patterns that drain you, less comfortable maintaining connections based solely on habit. Meanwhile, others may remain where they are, not because they are wrong, but because their path is different. Gradually, invitations slow down. Messages become less frequent. Conversations feel polite instead of natural. Nothing catastrophic has happened, yet something has changed. And this quiet distance can feel more unsettling than conflict. Growth often alters proximity. Some relationships deepen, some remain steady, some fade without drama, some transform into something quieter and more distant. You may find yourself spending more time alone, not out of rejection, but out of alignment. You begin seeking environments that reflect your evolving values. You gravitate toward conversations that feel meaningful rather than habitual. You invest energy where mutual respect exists. This is not abandonment, it is recalibration. But recalibration can feel like loss before it feels like clarity. Humans are biologically wired for connection. For most of human history, isolation did not simply mean loneliness, it meant danger. To be separated from the group meant vulnerability, exposure, reduced chances of survival. Although modern life is different, the nervous system still carries ancient wiring. So, when relationships shift or social circles change, the brain may interpret it as threat, not metaphorically, biologically. A subtle alarm activates. Am I alone? Am I safe? Do I still belong somewhere? This response is not weakness, it is evolutionary memory. Neuroscience shows that social rejection and physical pain activate similar neural pathways. Belonging is not merely emotional comfort, it is a regulatory system for safety. Connection lowers stress hormones. Shared presence regulates the nervous system. Social belonging signals security. So, when growth creates distance, the nervous system may respond with anxiety, restlessness, or guilt, not because you made the wrong choice, but because belonging is shifting. And the brain does not immediately distinguish between temporary transition and permanent abandonment. It simply senses change. There is often a transitional period during growth when you feel socially in between. You no longer feel aligned with certain environments. You have not yet fully found your new community. You are redefining connection rather than repeating it. This space can feel empty, quiet, unfamiliar, lonely. But it is also a space of recalibration. Old connections may fade before new ones emerge. Old rhythms dissolve before new patterns stabilize. And in this transitional silence, guilt can appear. Guilt often functions as a social preservation mechanism. It urges reconnection, encourages conformity, discourages divergence, protects belonging. If growth begins to distance you from familiar circles, guilt may whisper, "Go back. Don't change so much. Stay relatable. Stay where you are accepted." This is not a moral signal. It is a social survival reflex. For most of human history, staying with the group ensured safety. So your nervous system attempts to preserve connection, even when growth requires movement. The fear of loneliness during growth does not mean you are destined to be alone. It often signals a transition between versions of belonging. You are not losing connection, you are redefining it. Relationships built on unconscious roles may fade. Connections rooted in authenticity may emerge. Surface familiarity may give way to deeper alignment. But this transition takes time, and during that time, solitude may feel louder than clarity. If you feel guilt while growing apart from old environments, it does not mean you are abandoning connection. It may mean you are leaving environments where belonging required self-suppression. Your nervous system is adjusting. Your social identity is reorganizing. Your sense of belonging is evolving. And evolution often includes a temporary space between worlds. The instinct to return to the group is natural, but growth sometimes asks you to step beyond familiarity, not to live in isolation, but to discover connection that reflects who you are becoming. Because belonging is not lost when you grow, it is redefined. If you feel guilt while growing, it is easy to assume something is wrong, that you are hurting people, that you are becoming selfish, that you are doing life incorrectly. But often the feeling has less to do with morality and more to do with biology. Because your brain is not designed to prioritize growth. It is designed to prioritize survival. And survival depends on predictability. Your brain constantly scans the environment for safety. It does not ask, is this fulfilling? It asks, is this predictable? Is this known? Has this kept me safe before? If the answer is yes, the brain relaxes. Familiar routines feel safe. Familiar relationships feel safe. Familiar behaviors feel safe. Even familiar discomfort can feel safe. This is why people can remain in situations that make them unhappy, because predictability signals survival. The brain equates known with safe, even when known is painful. When you begin to grow, you disrupt predictability. You think differently. You respond differently. You set boundaries. You choose new behaviors. From a psychological perspective, this is progress. From a neurological perspective, it is uncertainty. And uncertainty activates the brain's threat detection system. Not because change is dangerous, but because it is unknown. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, responds to uncertainty by increasing vigilance. Heart rate may increase, tension may rise, anxiety may surface, doubt may intensify. This response is not a sign that you are making the wrong choice. It is a sign that you are entering unfamiliar territory. Your nervous system builds associations over time. If a behavior helped you avoid conflict, it became protective. If silence prevented rejection, it became protective. If compliance preserved belonging, it became protective. These patterns were not random. They helped you navigate your environment. So when growth invites you to abandon these patterns, your nervous system resists, not because the patterns are healthy, but because they are familiar, and familiarity signals safety. Guilt can function as a regulatory signal. It creates discomfort when you deviate from learned patterns. It urges you to return to behaviors that maintained connection. It reinforces social cohesion and predictability. If you were conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty, guilt appears when you speak truth. If you were conditioned to meet everyone's needs before your own, guilt appears when you set limits. If you were conditioned to avoid conflict, guilt appears when you express boundaries. This does not mean you are doing harm. It means you are breaking conditioned patterns, and the nervous system interprets deviation as risk. From a biological perspective, guilt can function as a corrective mechanism. It creates internal discomfort designed to restore social harmony and behavioral predictability. In early human societies, maintaining group cohesion was essential for survival. Behaviors that threatened group stability triggered corrective emotional responses, including guilt and shame, to encourage reintegration. Today, the same mechanisms remain active. So when you act outside familiar relational patterns, guilt may attempt to guide you back to the known, back to compliance, back to predictability, back to the version of yourself that preserved equilibrium. Not because that version was healthier, but because it was stable. One of the most important insights in personal growth is this: your nervous system does not distinguish between familiar pain and unfamiliar health. If something is familiar, it feels safer than something new, even if the new behavior supports your well-being. This is why setting boundaries can feel wrong at first, why speaking honestly can feel dangerous, why choosing yourself can feel uncomfortable. You are not doing something harmful. you are doing something unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity activates caution. Growth often feels uncomfortable because it requires neurological adaptation. New behaviors create new neural pathways. New responses replace conditioned reactions. New boundaries reshape relational patterns. This process requires repetition and time. At first, the brain interprets deviation as instability, but with repetition, the unfamiliar becomes familiar, and what once triggered guilt begins to feel natural. We often assume guilt means we have done something wrong. Sometimes it does. But during growth, guilt often signals something else. You are leaving conditioned behavior. You are challenging learned roles. You are redefining safety. You are breaking patterns that once ensured belonging. In these moments, guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. It is evidence of neurological transition. Every new behavior initially feels uncertain. Every new boundary initially feels uncomfortable. Every new way of relating initially feels unnatural. But this discomfort is not a warning to stop. It is part of adaptation. Your brain is updating its understanding of safety, and as it does, what once triggered guilt begins to feel aligned. If guilt appears as you grow, it does not mean you are betraying your values. It may mean your nervous system is adjusting to new patterns of safety. You are not losing stability, you are redefining it. Because growth is not only psychological, it is neurological, and the brain always resists change before it learns to trust it. Guilt, in this context, is not a moral judgment. It is a biological echo of your past conditioning, fading as you step into a new way of being. Long before you began making conscious choices, you inherited a set of invisible rules. Rules about success, rules about ambition, rules about belonging, rules about how much space you are allowed to occupy in the world. No one sat you down and explained them. You absorbed them through tone, reactions, warnings, jokes, silence, and observation. And because these messages were repeated over years, they became internal truths. So when you begin to grow beyond those inherited limits, guilt may arise. Not because growth is wrong, but because it violates the rules you were taught never to question. In many families and cultures, standing out is not encouraged. It is discouraged. You may have heard, "Don't attract attention. Stay humble. Do not show off. People will envy you. Keep your head down." On the surface, these messages sound like guidance. Underneath, they can communicate something deeper. Visibility is dangerous. Difference invites rejection. Success invites judgment. So you learn to remain within acceptable boundaries. Not too loud, not too ambitious, not too different. When growth invites you to become more visible, to express ideas, pursue opportunities, share your voice, the nervous system may interpret this as a violation of safety, and guilt appears. Belonging often depends on similarity. Shared behavior creates social comfort. Shared values create group identity. Shared expectations create predictability. So deviation can feel threatening to group cohesion. If you were raised with the message that fitting in ensures acceptance, individuality may feel risky. Choosing a different path, lifestyle, or worldview can trigger internal resistance. Why am I different? Will I still belong? Am I separating myself from my people? The pressure to remain like everyone else does not always come from others. Eventually, it lives inside you. Many people grow up hearing warnings about ambition and success. Money ruins people. Power corrupts. Rich people forget where they came from. Success makes you arrogant. These messages are often meant as protection against losing values, but they can also create unconscious associations. Success equals moral decline. Wealth equals disloyalty. Ambition equals selfishness. Advancement equals abandonment. So when you begin to succeed or pursue more for yourself, an inner conflict can emerge. If I grow, will I become someone I do not respect? Will others believe I have changed for the worse? Will success separate me from the people I love? This conflict can create guilt, not because growth is unethical, but because it contradicts inherited narratives. In some environments, ambition is celebrated. In others, it is quietly discouraged. You may have learned that wanting more is greedy, that striving is selfish, that contentment means not asking for change, that ambition implies dissatisfaction with what you have. As a result, desire itself can feel shameful. You may minimize your goals, avoid expressing dreams, downplay achievements, pretend you want less than you truly do. Not because you lack vision, but because you learned that wanting more threatens acceptance. Cultural and family systems often operate on implicit agreements. Stay relatable. Stay familiar. Stay within acceptable limits. Do not outgrow the system. These agreements maintain cohesion and predictability, but growth challenges inherited boundaries. You pursue education beyond what was expected. You adopt beliefs different from your upbringing. You prioritize mental health over endurance. You choose environments aligned with your values rather than tradition. And this can trigger a deep internal tension. Am I dishonoring where I came from? Am I rejecting my roots? Am I becoming someone they will not recognize? This tension often expresses itself as guilt. Humans are social beings, shaped by cultural expectations. When behavior deviates from group norms, internal discomfort can arise. Not because the behavior is wrong, but because it challenges social conditioning. This discomfort can manifest as guilt, for wanting more, for thinking differently, for choosing a new path, for becoming more visible, for pursuing opportunities unavailable to previous generations. In these moments, guilt is not about morality, it is about conformity. Growth does not require rejecting where you came from. It does not erase heritage, culture, or family bonds, but it may require examining which inherited beliefs still serve your well-being, and which were shaped by fear, scarcity, or survival conditions that no longer apply. You can honor your origins without repeating their limitations. You can respect your upbringing while redefining your possibilities. You can carry your roots with you without allowing them to restrict your expansion. If guilt appears as you evolve, it may not be about growth itself. It may be about crossing invisible boundaries you were taught never to cross. Being more visible than you were allowed to be. Wanting more than you were taught to want. Thinking differently than you were encouraged to think. Living beyond inherited expectations. And although these steps can feel like transgression, they are often expressions of self-authorship. Not rebellion, but emergence. Because growth does not erase where you came from. It expands what is possible beyond it. For much of your life, you may have learnt that being a good person meant being available, being agreeable, being accommodating, being reliable, being selfless. You learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to smooth tension before it escalated, to place harmony above personal comfort, to measure your worth by how useful you were to others. And for a long time, this felt natural, not because it was effortless, but because it was familiar. Then growth begins to introduce a new question. What about me? Choosing yourself does not usually begin with a dramatic declaration. It begins quietly. You pause before saying yes. You notice exhaustion instead of ignoring it. You decline what drains you. You stop volunteering for emotional labor you cannot sustain. At first, these shifts feel small, but internally they represent a profound reorientation, from external approval to internal alignment, from constant accommodation to balanced reciprocity, from self-neglect to self-respect. And this shift can feel deeply unfamiliar, because if your identity was shaped around being needed, stepping back can feel like abandoning a role that once defined your worth. Many people grow up equating duty with virtue. Responsibility meant saying yes. Love meant sacrifice. Care meant endurance. Loyalty meant self-denial. So, when personal needs begin to surface, rest, boundaries, emotional space, time for yourself, an internal conflict can emerge. If I choose my needs, am I neglecting my responsibilities? If I rest, am I failing someone? If I say no, am I being selfish? This conflict is not a sign of selfishness. It is a sign that two value systems are colliding. The learned belief that worth equals self-sacrifice, and the emerging awareness that health requires self-respect. If you were conditioned to prioritize others, self-prioritization can feel like violation. You may feel uneasy when you protect your time, uncomfortable when you express preferences, self-conscious when you decline requests, anxious when you stop overextending yourself. This discomfort is not proof that you are doing harm. It is evidence that you are stepping outside a familiar identity. For years, your nervous system associated approval with self-denial. So self-protection can feel like risk. Many people confuse self-care with self-centeredness, but they are not the same. Selfishness ignores the needs of others. Self-respect includes your needs alongside theirs. Selfishness takes without regard. Self-respect protects without harming. Selfishness demands. Self-respect defines. Yet, if you were taught that goodness requires self-sacrifice, self-respect can feel morally suspicious. You may feel the need to justify rest, explain boundaries, apologize for needing space, over-explain decisions that protect your well-being. This is not because your needs are excessive. It is because honoring them is new. Guilt often appears the first time you interrupt self-abandonment. You say no and feel uneasy. You take time for yourself and feel undeserving. You protect your energy and feel disloyal. You choose rest and feel irresponsible. This reaction is not accidental. If your worth was measured by how much you gave, giving less can feel like becoming less. But choosing yourself is not an act of rejection. It is an act of balance. There is a difference between neglecting others and neglecting yourself. For many people, growth involves recognizing that they have spent years meeting external expectations while quietly ignoring internal needs. Choosing yourself does not erase care for others. It prevents resentment. It prevents burnout. It prevents emotional depletion. It allows generosity to come from fullness rather than exhaustion. When self-neglect ends, genuine care becomes sustainable. The first time you choose yourself can feel unsettling. You may expect criticism, disappointment, withdrawal, judgment. Even if none of these occur, your nervous system may brace for them, because this is unfamiliar territory. But over time, something shifts. You begin to feel steadier, less resentful, more present, more authentic in your connections. And the guilt that once appeared begins to soften. When you choose yourself, relationships do not disappear. They transform. They move from obligation to willingness, from exhaustion to reciprocity, from silent resentment to honest communication. Some connections deepen, some adjust, some fade. But what remains becomes more honest, because it is no longer sustained by self-abandonment. If guilt appears when you prioritize yourself, it does not mean you are becoming selfish. It may mean you are interrupting patterns that required you to disappear. You are learning that your needs matter, that your time has value, that your well-being is not optional. For the first time, you are not placing yourself last. And although this shift may feel uncomfortable, it marks the beginning of balance, not the end of care. Because choosing yourself is not the opposite of loving others. It is what makes love sustainable. At some point in your growth, a surprising realization emerges. The guilt you feel may not be evidence that you are doing something wrong. It may be evidence that something inside you is changing. Because guilt often appears at the exact moment you step outside an old role, an old pattern, or an old version of yourself. Not when you stay the same, but when you begin to move. For years, you may have lived within roles that ensured acceptance. The one who never disappoints, the one who always agrees, the one who carries the emotional weight, the one who stays silent to keep peace, the one who does not ask for more. These roles provided stability and belonging, but growth asks you to loosen them, to speak instead of suppress, to set boundaries instead of overextending, to choose alignment instead of automatic compliance. And the moment you step outside the role, guilt can appear. Not because the new behavior is harmful, but because the old role is being released. Guilt, in this sense, is friction between who you were conditioned to be and who you are becoming. Transformation is not a smooth transition. It is a process of reorganization. Old beliefs are questioned. Old habits lose their grip. Old identities loosen. New patterns have not yet stabilized. During this transition, resistance is natural. Part of you seeks expansion. Part of you seeks familiarity. Part of you moves forward. Part of you hesitates. This internal tension is not failure. It is restructuring. Every meaningful change requires the nervous system, identity, and relational patterns to adapt. And adaptation is rarely comfortable. We are often taught that the right path should feel clear and confident, but growth frequently feels uncertain, uncomfortable, awkward, emotionally complex, unsteady. Not because you are lost, but because you are evolving. Discomfort signals that familiar structures are dissolving and new ones are forming. Just as muscles experience strain before strengthening, Identity experiences tension before stabilizing. Without tension, there is no adaptation. Without adaptation, there is no growth. When you release old roles, you temporarily lose the certainty they provided. You are no longer acting automatically. You are choosing consciously. You are navigating unfamiliar responses. This can feel like losing footing, but it is actually the process of learning to stand differently. Old stability was built on predictability. New stability is built on alignment. And alignment requires awareness, not autopilot. Comfort often comes from familiarity. Alignment comes from truth. You can remain comfortable by repeating known patterns. You grow aligned by living according to what is authentic. But alignment often disrupts comfort before it creates stability. This is why growth can feel unsettling at first. You are trading predictable comfort for conscious authenticity, and that transition creates friction. When behavior stays within familiar boundaries, there is little internal resistance, no tension, no guilt, no discomfort, because nothing is being challenged. But when you begin setting boundaries, speaking truth, redefining relationships, and choosing alignment over habit, friction appears. This friction is not evidence of error. It is evidence of movement. Just as a door that has never been opened resists at first, new patterns require pressure before they move freely. If guilt appears while you grow, it may signal that you are leaving conditioned roles behind. You are stepping beyond expectations. You are redefining safety. You are allowing authenticity to replace performance. This transition can feel disorienting, because the familiar self is loosening while the authentic self is still stabilizing. And in this space between identities, guilt often appears, not as a moral verdict, but as the echo of who you used to be. There is no meaningful transformation without discomfort. The body resists strain before strengthening. The mind resists uncertainty before adapting. Identity resists change before reorganizing. Discomfort is not the opposite of growth. It is the doorway to it. And while comfort preserves the familiar, discomfort makes evolution possible. If you feel guilt when you honor your needs, when you speak truth, when you set boundaries, when you choose alignment over approval, it does not necessarily mean you are doing harm. It may mean you are becoming more aware, more authentic, more self-respecting, more aligned with your inner truth. The absence of guilt does not always signal correctness. Sometimes it signals familiarity, and familiarity is where growth once stopped. Every new way of being feels uncertain at first, but what feels unnatural today can feel aligned tomorrow. What feels uncomfortable now can feel steady later. Because growth is not a single decision. It is a process of repeated alignment. And with repetition, the friction softens, the guilt quiets, the nervous system adapts, and what once felt like disruption begins to feel like integrity. Not abandoning who you were, not rejecting your past, but expanding beyond the limits that once defined you. And expansion always creates tension before it creates freedom. So if guilt walks beside you as you grow, it does not mean you are moving in the wrong direction. It may mean you are moving at all. Not all guilt means the same thing. Sometimes guilt signals that we have acted against our values. Sometimes it signals that we have disrupted expectations. And sometimes it appears simply because we are changing. Learning to distinguish between these experiences is essential, because without this clarity, you may apologize for your growth while ignoring behavior that truly requires repair. Healthy guilt arises when your actions cause real harm. You violate your own values. You act in a way that hurts someone unnecessarily. You behave dishonestly, cruelly, or irresponsibly. You betray trust or ignore accountability. Healthy guilt serves a constructive purpose. It signals misalignment between behavior and values. It encourages repair and responsibility. It motivates reflection and ethical growth. This form of guilt is not meant to punish you. It is meant to guide you back into integrity. When acknowledged and addressed, healthy guilt leads to accountability, apology, and improved behavior. And once repair is made, it softens. False guilt appears even when you have done nothing wrong. You set a boundary. You say no. You choose rest. You protect your time. You pursue growth. You stop tolerating harmful dynamics. And still, guilt appears. Not because harm occurred, but because expectations were disrupted. False guilt often emerges when you stop meeting unspoken demands. It arises when you withdraw from roles that required self-sacrifice. It appears when others are uncomfortable with your boundaries. This guilt is not rooted in ethics. It is rooted in conditioning. In some environments, guilt is used, consciously or unconsciously, to maintain control. It may sound like, "After everything I've done for you, you've changed. You only care about yourself now. I guess I just don't matter anymore." A good person wouldn't do that. These messages do not always express harm. They express resistance to change. Guilt can be used to restore old dynamics, preserve access, or discourage independence. Over time, you may internalize these messages and begin policing your own behavior, feeling guilty simply for protecting your well-being. Even when guilt is misplaced, the emotional sensation is genuine. Your nervous system learned early that maintaining harmony preserved connection. So when you disrupt expectations, internal alarms activate. You may feel tension in your chest, unease in your stomach, restlessness in your thoughts, an urge to explain, apologize, or reverse your decision. This does not mean you did something wrong. It means you interrupted a familiar pattern, and familiar patterns once ensured belonging. When guilt arises, clarity comes from reflection rather than reaction. Ask yourself, did I cause actual harm, or did I create discomfort? Harm violates well-being. Discomfort often accompanies change. Did I act against my values, or did I honor my needs? Integrity aligns behavior with values. Am I responsible for someone's pain, or are they reacting to unmet expectations? Not all emotional reactions indicate wrongdoing. Would I expect someone else to sacrifice themselves in this situation? If not, why must you? Am I apologizing to restore harmony, or because repair is truly needed? These questions shift the focus from reflexive guilt to conscious evaluation. Growth can create discomfort in others. Boundaries may inconvenience people, Honesty may challenge expectations. Change may disrupt familiarity. But discomfort is not the same as harm. Harm involves violation, disrespect, or neglect of responsibility. Discomfort often signals adjustment. If your growth creates discomfort, it does not automatically mean you caused damage. It may mean dynamics are changing. Guilt deserves attention when it points to misalignment with your values. It deserves release when it arises from self-respect, boundaries, or personal growth. Listening to healthy guilt builds integrity. Releasing false guilt builds freedom. Both are necessary. If your growth disrupts expectations, others may feel uncomfortable. But their discomfort does not always require your self-abandonment. You are responsible for acting with integrity. You are not responsible for maintaining every emotional equilibrium. Relationships evolve. Dynamics adjust. Expectations shift. And growth often requires tolerating temporary discomfort, your own and others. Guilt can be a moral guide. It can also be an echo of conditioning. Learning to distinguish between the two allows you to grow without abandoning your values, and to remain compassionate without abandoning yourself. You do not need to silence guilt, but you do need to understand it. Because when guilt is deserved, it guides repair. And when it is misplaced, releasing it allows transformation to continue. Understanding why guilt appears is powerful, but understanding alone does not dissolve it. Because guilt during growth is not only cognitive, it is emotional, relational, and neurological. Releasing it requires practice, not perfection. It requires learning to stand in your evolution without retreating back into old roles for comfort. Growth does not ask you to become indifferent. It asks you to become authentic. And authenticity requires courage. Nothing in nature remains static. Seasons shift, cells regenerate, ideas evolve, relationships transform, identities mature. Change is not a deviation from life. It is the movement of life. Yet many people unconsciously believe that remaining the same preserves loyalty, belonging, or love. It does not. What preserves connection is honesty and presence, not stagnation. Allow yourself to recognize you are not betraying your past. You are continuing your development. You are not abandoning who you were. You are expanding beyond it. Growth is not an act of disloyalty. It is an act of becoming. One of the hidden burdens people carry is the belief that they are responsible for everyone's emotional responses. If someone feels disappointed, you feel guilty. If someone feels uncomfortable, you feel responsible. If someone resists your change, you feel obligated to soften it. But growth requires releasing the illusion that you can control how others feel. People interpret change through their own fears, expectations, and readiness. Some will understand. Some will need time. Some may resist. Some may never fully adjust. Their reactions belong to them. Your responsibility is to act with integrity, not to manage perception. When you first begin setting boundaries, you may feel compelled to justify them. You explain extensively, provide context, offer reassurance, apologize for inconvenience, soften your language to avoid discomfort. This is natural, especially if you were conditioned to maintain harmony. But boundaries do not require elaborate defense. They require clarity. Over-explaining often comes from discomfort with your own right to set limits. As self-trust grows, boundaries become simpler. I can't do that. I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. I need to step back. Clarity is not cruelty. It is honesty. Many people equate being loved with being easy. Easy to rely on, easy to access, easy to ask favors from, easy to accommodate. But being convenient is not the same as being valued. If your worth has been tied to usefulness, stepping out of constant availability can feel dangerous. You may fear losing approval, being perceived as difficult, disappointing others, disrupting harmony. But relationships built solely on convenience are sustained by self-neglect. Authentic relationships allow for boundaries, limits, and mutual respect. You are not required to remain convenient to remain worthy of connection. Releasing guilt does not mean discomfort disappears immediately. You may still feel uneasy when you say no, still feel tension when you protect your time, still feel internal resistance when you choose alignment over approval. This does not mean you are regressing. It means you are practicing a new way of being. With repetition, the nervous system recalibrates. What once felt uncomfortable becomes neutral. What once triggered guilt becomes natural. What once required courage becomes standard. Growth feels unnatural before it feels aligned. You may have spent years fulfilling roles that ensured acceptance. The peacemaker, the dependable one, the selfless helper, the emotional caretaker, the one who never disappoints. These roles were not failures. They were adaptations. They helped you belong. They helped you survive. They helped you navigate relationships. But growth may require releasing roles that demand self-abandonment. This does not erase your kindness. It removes the expectation that kindness requires self-erasure. Growth can feel emotionally complex. You may feel relief and grief simultaneously, confidence and uncertainty, freedom and guilt. All of these experiences can coexist. Speak to yourself with the same compassion you offer others. Instead of, "I am selfish," try, "I am learning balance." Instead of, "I am hurting people," try, "I am changing patterns." Instead of, "I feel guilty, so I must be wrong," try, "I feel guilty because this is new." Self-compassion reduces the intensity of guilt and allows adaptation to continue. Growth does not always look dramatic. Often it looks like saying no without apologizing, resting without justification, choosing honesty over harmony, stepping back from draining dynamics, allowing distance where alignment is absent. These moments may seem small, but they represent profound courage. Because courage is not the absence of fear, it is movement despite discomfort. You cannot become who you are meant to be while performing who you were expected to be. Growth asks you to release roles that no longer fit, to tolerate temporary discomfort, to endure misunderstanding, to navigate uncertainty, to trust alignment over approval. This process requires bravery, not loud bravery, quiet bravery. The bravery to stand in authenticity without retreating into familiarity. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to outgrow patterns. You are allowed to redefine relationships. You are allowed to protect your well-being. You are allowed to become more yourself. If guilt appears, acknowledge it, but do not let it dictate your direction. Because growth does not ask you to become someone else. It asks you to become who you have always been beneath expectation. And becoming requires the courage to release the roles that once kept you small. At the end of every meaningful period of growth, a quiet realization emerges. You did not lose yourself. You found yourself. What once felt like disorientation begins to feel like clarity. What once felt like guilt begins to soften into calm. What once felt like loss begins to reveal space. Because growth does not erase who you are, it removes what you were never meant to carry. During transformation, it can feel as if everything is falling apart. Relationships shift, roles dissolve, habits change, priorities realign, certainty fades. From the inside, this can feel like destruction. But from a deeper perspective, it is refinement. Growth removes what no longer fits, releases what no longer supports you, reveals what was hidden beneath adaptation and expectation. It is not the breaking of life, it is the clearing of noise. For years, you carried versions of yourself designed for survival. The agreeable self, the silent self, the accommodating self, the self that avoided conflict, the self that stayed small to remain accepted. These versions were not false, they were adaptive. They helped you navigate environments, relationships, and expectations. But survival identities are not the same as authentic identity. Growth does not destroy who you are, it releases who you had to be. There is a phase in transformation where guilt feels constant. Every boundary feels wrong. Every decision feels selfish. Every change feels disloyal. But if you continue honoring alignment, something begins to shift. The guilt softens, the nervous system settles, self-trust strengthens, clarity replaces inner conflict. What once felt heavy becomes steady, and freedom begins quietly. Not as a dramatic revelation, but as the absence of internal tension. Inner freedom is not perfection. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is the absence of internal contradiction. It feels like making decisions without abandoning yourself, speaking honestly without fear of losing identity, resting without needing justification, existing without performing for acceptance, maintaining connection without losing authenticity. Freedom is not doing whatever you want. It is no longer living against yourself. When you release old roles, constant internal negotiation begins to fade. You no longer rehearse conversations in your head. You no longer analyze every decision for approval. You no longer carry resentment from silent self-betrayal. Energy once spent on maintaining roles becomes available for presence. Life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes clearer, and clarity reduces inner noise. When you stop performing old identities, relationships change. Some deepen through authenticity. Some evolve into healthier dynamics. Some gently fade where alignment no longer exists. What remains is no longer sustained by obligation, it is sustained by truth. Connection becomes less about roles and more about presence. One of the most profound outcomes of growth is self-trust. You trust your boundaries. You trust your needs. You trust your perceptions. You trust your decisions. You trust your inner signals. This trust replaces the constant search for external permission. And with self-trust comes stability. Not the stability of sameness, but the stability of alignment. The guilt you felt was not a permanent state. It was a transition, a bridge between identities, a signal of adjustment, an echo of conditioning, a response to unfamiliar territory. It accompanied you while you crossed from conditioned roles to conscious authenticity. But bridges are meant to be crossed, not lived upon. You became more yourself, less filtered by expectation, less shaped by fear, less confined by roles, less driven by approval, more honest, more grounded, more present, more aligned. This is not transformation into a different person. It is a return to your own center. After the noise settles, what remains is not emptiness. It is space. Space for clarity, space for honest connection, space for rest, space for purpose, space for authenticity. Growth does not take your life away. It makes room for the life that fits you. There was a time when belonging required performance. Now belonging begins with truth. There was a time when safety required silence. Now safety includes self-expression. There was a time when love required self-erasure. Now love includes self-respect. You did not lose yourself. You uncovered yourself. Inner freedom does not announce itself. It arrives softly, in the absence of inner conflict, in the relief of authenticity, in the calm of alignment, in the quiet certainty that you no longer need to pretend. And when you look back, you may realize the guilt you feared was not a warning. It was a passage, a bridge between the person you were conditioned to be and the person you are finally free to become.